Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Good morning.
So y'all have a lot to say this morning. It's nice to see a large group in the room and everyone reconnecting and folks having lots to say today. So it's the last Dharma talk, the last Sunday meeting of 2024. So as we know, up to this point, we've been talking about the practice vision for the last few weeks. We've been talking about the practice vision as we're heading into 2025. Last week I introduced the meaning of nyoho, the broad meaning of nyoho, things or activities or something according to Dharma, done according to the Dharma. So again, the central question that nyoho, a nyoho approach calls on us to consider is, does this thing, this activity, this whatever it is, create attachment, create clinging? How can we minimize our tendency, right, to grasp? So this thing, whatever this thing is, might be anything we encounter. It might be something more abstract, like an idea or a ceremony, an activity. It could be something more concrete, like the three faces of nyoho: clothing, food, and shelter. So these are the things we're going to talk about today. So while we already know, of course, everything is already 100% expressing the Dharma, there's already nothing missing in what's going on, these three faces are meaningful Dharma gates for us. We can practice with how we give shape to, how we embody, how we encounter the Dharma in a concrete way. So we encounter food, clothing, and shelter every day. These are Dharma gates that are in front of us all the time. So this is very immediate, very direct, very personal, feels very personal. So today I want to look at the specifics of our practice related to these three faces: food, clothing, and shelter, according to the guidelines that we've inherited, these nyoho guidelines that we've inherited that go all the way back to the Vinaya, going, again, there's a through line, right? We can start with the Vinaya, we're going all the way through to Sawaki Roshi and our 20th century ancestors. So these things have very, very deep roots, and yet they are very much a central part of our practice, coming directly from our immediate ancestors. So you have a new handout today, virtual folks. It's posted there for you. It's something I'm calling nyoho 9-patch. One of the things I do is quilting, and that's a quilt pattern, a 9-patch pattern. So you can see that you have this handout today. It shows the three faces, and it shows the three elements of those three faces, which we've talked about before. My suggestion is, if you want to, if your brain works this way, write your name on that nyoho 9-patch, leave it in the plastic sleeve, and then we'll know that that's your plastic sleeve, and Sawyer will create some kind of a box or a folder or something. You can just keep those things here for all year if you want to. We've included in that sleeve not only the nyoho 9-patch, but also the practice vision. You're welcome to just keep these things together and take notes on them during the year, including writing notes to yourself about something. This reminds me of something I want to go investigate, or this reminds me of a question I want to consider. You can consider that plastic sleeve yours for the year if you want it. I know we take things home, we forget them, we lose them, we don't remember to bring them back. So my thinking is, if your brain works this way and it's useful to you, keep that stuff here. This is a conversation that's happening for at least the next 12 months. So clearly, 2 little pieces of paper is not going to contain, all of your insights for the year. Feel free to add. I can't believe this is the last handout we're going to have. Feel free to bring your own notebook, bring your own pad of paper, whatever you want to do. Keep it together. We will find some way for you to just keep those things here, if that works for you. If it doesn't, it's not a requirement. But what you're seeing here is the way my brain works. So that's why the plastic sleeve. It's a place to just keep things. We will know if we can see your name on something. Don't write on the plastic, write on the paper, but then we'll know, right, that that's yours. And you can leave it for the year, add to it all year long if you want to. My hope is, as I say, this is a growing conversation. So I can't believe these things aren't going to come up in Wednesday evening discussions, that they aren't going to come up in other places. Those of you that sew on Tuesday nights, things are going to come up for you, right? You've got a place to keep that stuff. So I just want to make these things available to you for your own discernment. I've never seen another sort of nyoho 9-patch. I've never seen a chart made like that. I'm sure somebody's done it somewhere because it's so obvious to me, but I've never seen another one. So we may be breaking new ground. Anyway, this is how I kind of see nyoho, and it may be useful for you as well. So I put in there some of the basic information we've discussed. You'll very quickly see that some items can go in more than one box. To me, that says we're on the right track. These teachers are really interpenetrated. We really can't pull them apart in the largest possible view. So there's nothing here that's a wacky outlier, right? All these things are connected to each other. So connect these in whatever way your brain connects them, but you will quickly see it's even a little bit arbitrary to start dropping things into boxes. So before I launch into all of this, I just want to say, for a Sangha of mostly lay practitioners and all of us who are commuting, nobody lives here except Toto-san, we are talking here about a general approach to our lives. How do we make sure that overall our lives are in accordance with Dharma? I am not advocating extreme measures here, and it would be possible to take these things and be very, very rigid. Please don't do that. Nobody is asking for that. I wouldn't be advocating extreme measures even if we were all living together in a training temple. That's not the point of this thing. So when this says there's certain colors that we do or there's certain materials that we use, general, think about how that is a manifestation of something. Don't just make a list and go, I can't ever wear something that's, fuchsia. That's not the point here. Please don't take it that way. We use what we have. We adapt to the reality of here and now in the middle way, right? So these are guidelines. These are not something we should cling to in some way which is unwholesome. So what's useful for us as 21st century North American householders is that nyoho refers to ethical teachings. It refers to Dharma teachings. That's the point for us. Yes, there are rules governing the material aspects of an ordained person in a Sangha living in a training temple. Yes, and those things are useful. Yes, we follow those things, but food, clothing, shelter are Dharma gates into those teachings. So we need to take these things and use them in some way which is meaningful and appropriate and relevant, right, for us in the actual karmic life that we're living with this body and mind. So put these teachings along temple life, and they look like one thing. Put them alongside householder life, they manifest differently. And yet there's a spirit there that we don't want to lose, right? The spirit, the approach, right, the view is the same. So as we've seen, there are three aspects to something made or done according to nyoho. We have tai, or materials, using what's appropriate, something that isn't going to cause suffering. Generally, again, these materials are unpretentious. They're fit for purpose. They're often local, something we can gather or acquire locally. We have shiki, or color. So again, using colors that don't cause attachment, don't cause suffering. We sometimes think of these as broken colors, right? Not clear primary colors. Not clear primary colors, or white or black. Something indistinct, something muddy, something not flashy. And the third one, of course, is ryo, or amount, which points us toward having few desires, knowing satisfaction, not having too much, but also not having too little. This is not about being a martyr, right? We need what we need in order to live in a healthy way, in a wholesome way. So last week we saw that based on these three aspects and on nyoho guidelines overall, nyoho things have a certain set of characteristics. They are unpretentious, they are unassuming. These are not the things that stand up and wave their arms at us. They are made from what we actually have, including often reusing something we have or reusing what we can. They honor and maintain our connection to the past, so they're not a complete break from the past. And as we saw, this nyoho thing, whatever this nyoho thing is the only thing. This is the only cup. This is the only raksu. There is nothing outside of this nyoho thing. So, food, clothing, and shelter. So let's start with clothing. We'll be focusing on clothing from January through April. So the first 4 months we're going to focus on teachings about that. So traditionally, of course, in an ordained Sangha, clothing means raksu and okesa, robes. The rules are written for that, but we can take those teachings and apply them, I think, to our approach to clothing in general, whatever it is we're wearing. Even people in an ordained Sangha don't wear robes all the time. This is not a 24-hour, uniform. So beginning with guidelines for robes, and looking at how they maybe apply more broadly. So traditionally, our robes, of course, are made from cast-off materials, something nobody has any attachment to. So that might be rags picked from corpses, it might be cloth found in the street, something chewed by mice, something nobody else would want. Not only because there's no attachment to these things or nobody wants these things, not only because they may be dirty, they may be damaged, but If they're coming from corpses, it's associated with death and with funeral rituals, and so that's kind of off-putting, right? That's not something we typically go looking for. So the practice of washing this fabric, trimming off the pieces we can't use because they're stained or damaged or something, turning this cloth that nobody wants into Buddha's robe is a purification process. So, and as well, we'll see over the course of the year, the way we do something can be as important for nyoho as the actual thing that we create or the thing that we're using. So we can tie this to teachings about reusing what we have, right? Making use of what already exists. So in modern Soto Zen, we don't get fabric this way. We don't go out and pick things from corpses or find cloth in the street, although I can't tell you how many pieces of perfectly good clothing I find in the street. Things that have fallen off of cars or I don't know what. I have an amazing number of usable clothing items that I picked off the street and washed. But, that's a story for another day. But generally, we do use simple fabric, typically. Usually at least partially natural fibers. So it's usually not entirely synthetic. We cut it up into pieces before we sew it back together, whether it's okeso or rakusu, because cutting that up makes it not good for anything else, right? We can't, if it's in little pieces, we can't use it for something else. So the color is a blended shade. It's a color that's not exciting. The term is ejiki in everyday speech. That first kanji is used in a word like kawareru, to be broken, to be damaged. And the second kanji is the same as shiki, or color. So it's a broken color, literally a broken color, not a clear color, not something flashy, not dead black, as we've heard, a black dye was expensive and fancy. So not dead black. Not white, because white was considered the color for lay people. So we see how we get to some of these guidelines. So the Soto Zen standard is you wear blue black or rusty black if you're a novice, right? If you're a transmitted teacher, some kind of brown. In fact, the word kesa originally meant reddish brown. Kesa was not the cloth or something. It was actually the color, reddish brown. So in India, the monks used to make a dye from nuts and barks of a tree that was fairly common. It was pretty easy dye to make. It was pretty easy to get your robes to be this color, because this was a tree that was around, was not exotic. So the Buddha said there were 6 acceptable sources of dye for robes: roots, stems, bark, leaves, flowers, and fruits. So pretty much any part of a plant, right? Any part of a plant you could coax some color out of was usable for dyeing robes. So today here at Sanshin, you may know, we have walnut trees growing on the property. We didn't plant them for that particular reason, but we sometimes make dye from those walnuts that fall every autumn. Usually you can see that there's probably a couple of buckets of walnuts sitting somewhere, right? We can make dye for that and use it for changing the color of the robe fabric. So sometimes we have a fabric which is too bright or too strong. We can sadden that color a little bit with a very simple walnut dye. So it just so happened when I arrived, I knew something about that dye. As I say, we didn't plant those walnut trees for that purpose, but here we are using what we have, right? Mostly those walnuts fall down and get in the way of the lawnmower. We kind of cursed them because it was a cleanup project, right? And they're messy because that dye is leaking out. Well, guess what? We can put them in a pot and boil them with water and actually make something usable, make a usable dye. So that feels very much in the tradition of this practice, even though we're simply using what we have. This feels very much like something Buddha would have said, yes, that's okay, right? So, materials and color. Size. Size is just right for this particular wearer, whoever that wearer is. So it's neither so large that the fabric is wasted, and it's not too small to cover the body. There are regulations about how much of the body this robe should be covering. So as I've mentioned previously, we calculate the size for each person, right? So we take this measurement, if it's an okeso, we take this measurement and calculate the size of everything based on that measurement. So it is very much about a person with a robe. Also, when we think about size, we can think about amount. So Buddha's Sangha, Buddha's monks, only owned 3 robes. I own more than that. Several of us do. Buddha's monks only owned 3. So we can consider not only the size of the robe, but the number of robes we need. And in this day and age, if you're from a nyoho place and you also function in a standard Sotoshu situation, you sometimes have multiples, because one thing is appropriate for one place and another thing is appropriate for another place. So how can we apply these teachings to our everyday life, to our standard clothing that doesn't look like robes? There are some things I think we can consider and some questions we can ask ourselves. Again, not to take some kind of extreme position, simply to do some discernment about our habits. What habits do we fall into? So do we dress in some way that's designed to call attention to ourselves, or in some way which is unwholesome or is inappropriate, right? That might mean we must have the latest and greatest, or we must have the most expensive, or we must have the most high-end or something. It might mean being obsessed with our appearance. Are we attractive? Are we sexy? Are we pretty, beautiful, handsome? If you like to make things, you're now seeing my public mea culpa. If you like to make things, maybe you're telegraphing that you have the skills to sew, knit, weave, crochet, design, paint on fabric, whatever it is, right? Because you're wearing your artwork. I love to make stuff. I own too much stuff because I like to make it. I don't need it. I just enjoy the process of making. So we can see how quickly virtues can become hindrances. So we have to just pay attention. So how about amount? How much clothing do we actually need? I've been living in temporary housing for 5 months with basically the belongings I could fit in my car. And it really reminded me of when I was training in Japan because, I had what I could bring on an airplane. And that's what you got, right? It's a wonderful reminder about how little we actually need. So I wouldn't say overall, I don't own closets and closets of fancy clothing, but I'm starting to miss like my winter clothing. I don't have most of my sweaters, right? I'm starting to realize how much I have and how much I have with me now. It's a great reminder that we just don't really need that much in order to function. So where does our clothing come from? Does it always need to be new? Where does it go when we're done with it? Have you ever followed that stream? That's a whole interesting project, right? So the most cursory look at the textile waste problem we have on this planet is enough to show, managing what we buy and throw away is critical. And clothing is a huge piece of that. So the textile industry is responsible for about 20% of the world's water pollution. The average lifespan of a clothing item has decreased over time. We often wear something now fewer than 10 times before we get rid of it. It's really become kind of disposable. So we can consider that whole process, right? Not to be extreme, don't do something crazy, but we can do a little discernment around how much do we really need and then where does it go when we're done with it. So we can also consider natural fibers versus synthetics. Buddha said there were 6 acceptable fibers for robes: linen, cotton, silk, wool, coarse hempen cloth, and canvas. So of course in those days there were no synthetic fabrics. So I'm not sure what would be unacceptable among fabrics of that day. And we can have a big conversation about silk. Silk is under debate. Conversation for another day. Anyway, natural fibers can be the most comfortable and they're biodegradable. So there are some reasons to just think about that. They don't release microplastics into the water, into the food chain every time we wash them. We can also think about dyes, chemical processes, all the stuff that goes with that. So you can see how this very quickly becomes much bigger than an okesa. It's not separate from this, but if you think this is not relevant for you because you don't wear these things, please take a step back and consider, right, the role of clothing in just how we live. Clearly, there's plenty we can practice with here, right, no matter what our karmic circumstances are. So, food. There is a lot to say about nyoho food. Good, we're going to spend 4 months thinking about nyoho food. May through August, we're going to deal with food. There's a lot of new info on our website that you can spend some time with. We're building that out, practically every day. So here at Sanshin, we're using sesshin food as an important dharma gate. So in addition to growing some of our own food under Sawyer's direction and others, we get food from local farms. It's a real opportunity to investigate teachings about 2 kinds of food: shomyo jiki and jamyo jiki. I think these are on your sheet, right? Shomyo jiki, the first 2 kanji are right livelihood from the Eightfold Path. So this is very directly related to our practice. The last is food or meal. So the right kind of monk's livelihood is by mendicancy, right? By going out and accepting alms. This is right livelihood food. Then we have jamyo jiki. First kanji is generally hindrance, obstacle, interference, but it can also mean a demon that hinders Buddhist training. So this is a demon that obstructs sentient beings from maintaining moral behavior. Now we're right back to ethical practices, right? Wrong livelihood food. We have right livelihood food and wrong livelihood food, which is an interesting way to think about our food, right? So food often comes at the cost of the lives of other beings. It could be plants, it could be animals. Sometimes it's the production method of the food that costs lives, or let's think about transportation of that food. So shomyo-jiki is food obtained the right way, if you will, but also food that's wholesome. It's beneficial for mind and body. Something that supports our practice, supports the practice of us, but also others, right? How are we thinking about the larger network? So it makes the best use of resources, including the lives of those other beings. So vow and repentance, right? How are we using this food we're taking in? How are we using these lives of other beings? What are we turning that into and putting back into the network, right? So food practice can help us cultivate gratitude, cultivate empathy for the life source of these ingredients, and to deeply see the interconnectedness of the lives of the people who are cooking and eating together, and even the people who are bringing us that food, growing it, moving it, taking care of it. So in general, we want good quality food, not something that's extravagant, something that's cost effective, but not necessarily the cheapest thing out there if the cheapest thing out there is not wholesome, healthy, right? As part of your practice, you can consider seasonality, what's available where we live, what's available in this season, if you want to. You can think about that. We think about that a little bit when it comes to sesshin food because we're using that as a real crucible, a real proving ground, right? A real sort of training ground for our practice. So what's available right now, right here? Otherwise, it's been trucked in from somewhere. It may have been picked, before it was ready. I mean, all the things that go with that, right? So again, don't be extreme, but you might consider. There are some specific guidelines we observe when we're making food for sesshin that point to overall food practice in the temple. So again, sesshin food is a microcosm, right, to help us understand those guidelines and that approach so that we can think about it more broadly outside of sesshin. So again, you can look at your 9-patch. I've got some of the kind of specifics there. We don't use the 5 pungent herbs, or what we might call aromatics: onion, garlic, leeks, shallots, chives. In a sesshin, you will not find those things in your bowl. It comes from a very old teaching. Those aromatics were considered by Hindu practice to be rajasic, or expanding foods. They stimulate passion, they stimulate the intellect. So why would you put that in someone's bowl if they're sitting 14, 50-minute periods a day, right? When the idea is drop off body and mind and settle down, you want to be careful what you're eating or what you're serving to people who are practicing. So these might be things that cloud the mind or interfere with your sitting practice. So that doesn't mean you can't ever eat pizza and onion rings. This is not what we're saying here, right? Just be thoughtful about it. It means we get the chance to step back. We get to look at our habits. So if you know you're going to go sit zazen or do some kind of practice, like what are you doing right before that? Dogen says, eat and drink moderately, right? And then what are we putting into our bodies in that circumstance? So when I started cooking this way years ago in my very first Sangha, dropping off those aromatics during sesshin and retreat, I thought, well, people might come to me later and say, oh, the food is really boring. It's really bland. And instead what they were saying was, wow, everything you make tastes really fresh, right? Like carrots tasted like carrots. Potatoes tasted like potatoes. There wasn't this overlay of other stuff. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, right? People could actually taste vegetables. So not that those seasonings are bad and that we can never eat them, but what if we left them out and tried to see what does that food actually taste like? So there's no lingering, what I discovered about that during sesshin was there was no kind of lingering aftertaste that I couldn't wait to get to the peppermint tea and kind of wash away, right? So, it's helpful for that. It may be that you notice your digestive system behaving differently when you eat those things and then you come and sit zazen. So again, it's a chance to just step back and do some discernment. So the point is to nourish people, to support practice, not to serve some impressive dish that sort of feeds our ego. And I say that from experience because when I was a beginning Tenzo, I was up until 2 o'clock the night before, chopping and prepping and trying to make the most impressive things I could for people because I didn't understand. There was nobody around at that point, to explain to me, that's not the point of this. You're feeding your ego, you're not feeding practitioners, and you're not feeding practice. So as for color, and as we know, color by extension, taste, because we know color often means atmosphere, tone, right? So we can include taste in there. There are very specific guidelines. We make sure every meal includes the 6 tastes: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, mild, and spicy, to the degree possible. We maybe can't get them all in there. Again, this is not about being extreme. To the degree possible, we try to get those 6 in there. Choice of ingredients also affects what the dish looks like, as well as how the dish tastes. So, nyoho of shiki, or color, ensures that this meal is nutritionally balanced as well as visually appealing. So we do that by including all the 5 color groups: red, white, black, green or blue, and yellow. Again, to the degree possible. We've only got 3 bowls in an oryoki meal. So, and so by the way, in a formal meal, typically for us, that first bowl is grain, the second bowl is protein, the third bowl is produce. So if we overlay 6 tastes, 5 colors, 3 bowls, we have the basis for a balanced meal plan. So because we've been doing this during Sesshin for about a year, we have a number of meal plans that we've developed and use and go back to. I'm going to start posting those on the website as well. So if you want to just have a look at that, they're not up there yet. I'm working with Sawyer and Esho to collect those things, simply as examples, not that you need to eat this way every day. Particularly, I want to put them out there for other sanghas that may be developing or beginning to develop meal practice so that they have a basis and something to look at. So if those are useful for your sangha, they are available to you. Okay, so when we think about overlaying 6 tastes, 5 colors, 3 bowls, we can see what that gives us is the chance not to make everything the same. So please don't, if you're a Tenzo for a Sesshin, please don't serve a meal of oatmeal and peanut butter toast and cinnamon applesauce. They taste great. We love them all. They're all brown, right? It's nutritionally balanced, but you're going to have, bowls with everything brown. Please do not serve rice, cream soup, and cauliflower. Everything's white, right? So we need to think about that. Also, by the way, we try to make sure we haven't cooked everything the same way. So everything shouldn't be boiled, everything shouldn't be braised, everything shouldn't be raw. So now we've talked about tai or material, we've talked about shiki or color, that leaves ryo, size, amount. Amount and food. So much to talk about there, right? One thing I heard a lot in the training temple was mottai nai, what a waste, or don't waste things. Don't waste food, don't waste anything. The expectation is you don't lose even a grain of rice. I remember seeing once something had happened, a container of rice had broken, and people were down there picking up every grain in the kitchen. So in the temple, of course, all the food comes from donations, whether that's directly, someone directly donated that food or they gave money to the temple and that money was used to buy the food. All of that is coming from someplace, right? So that's all donations to the temple. We are not allowed to treat donations like that. We're not allowed to waste them. So all donations are an offering to Buddha, so they're not different than the flowers and the incense on the altar. What if we treated all of our food like that? So the practice is to find a way to use almost everything. So if you boil vegetables to make a soup stock, someplace you use those vegetables. If you have leftovers, you turn them into something else. If all else fails, you make compost, right? And you grow more vegetables. So nothing is just wasted. There's an understanding, if you're a really good Tenzo, you produce almost no garbage. So what an interesting way to approach our food. So this is not like cooking for the family reunion where we just say, well, we're going to cook twice what we think we need to make sure everyone's got enough and that we look like good hosts and all that stuff, right? No, for several reasons. The practice is to pay attention to what you're doing and to cook the right amount. So if there's no one at your Dharma center, there's no one at your house to eat leftovers, where does all that food go, right? That's a waste. Not only is it poor stewardship financially, but in the temple, again, all that food was a donation, so we're not allowed to treat donations like that. Outside of the temple, a lot of beings, human and not human, contributed to making that food available to us. So what are we doing, right? How are we thinking about that? So, food. as you see, tons of conversations we can have about growing food, cooking food, amounts of food, what we're serving, where it's coming from, right? Huge conversation. Okay, shelter. We're going to take on nyoho shelter from September to December. And I have to say, this is, of the three, I think the most new territory. I don't know a lot of people talking about this. I'm having trouble even finding other people having a conversation about this. So this, I think if we can dig into this, is going to be useful for us and also for others, right? So when we think about nyoho shelter, again, we can apply Taishi Kyuryo, we can apply things like unassuming and use what we have and all of that. So a zendo like this, simple, clean, made without elaborate decoration, not made of fancy building materials, but this is sturdy, it's warm, it's safe, it contains everything we need to practice, it's enough room for the people who are here, it's appropriate. So as we continue to explore this, as I say, I think we're going to have conversations that have not been had before. At least in North America, I haven't found a lot of people engaging in this. So, you know, we eat every day, we dress every day, we don't build buildings every day. Many of us are reusing buildings that existed for some other purpose. So this is not a conversation we typically have. So we can start by observing what we can about materials and color and size as they relate to a traditional Japanese temple, and then in our ongoing conversations, again, let's see what that means for us more broadly. Most of us are not living in temples or working in temples, right? We're in and out of a lot of structures in our lives. So like, how do we think about that? So the main material for these traditional temples is almost always wood in some form. So it might be planks, it might be straw, it might be bark, for something other than something like a stone foundation. Maybe you need a stone foundation in the temple. The rest of it is almost always wood. Something like 70% of Japan is or was covered by forests, so that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Wood is what we have to work with. This was the material that was most available. So when it comes to color, generally wood is left natural. It's not painted. The grain is visible, the texture is visible. We know that it's wood. We know what it's made out of. If the walls are plastered and painted, then the color, in my experience, is usually something unobtrusive. It's a warm white. Maybe it's a sage green. It's not a bright color. The floors are wood or tatami, or occasionally stone or concrete if you get to, you know, a small area that gets a lot of wear. If you look at the Soto at Eheji, I think it's stone. Right? So floors are natural material. So as for the size is really interesting because it's infinitely changeable for a bunch of different reasons. Well, two main ones. One is that the boundary between inside and outside is pretty indistinct. We don't always know. You know, that's a really permeable boundary. So there's often big doors that open all the way up. So, you know, there's no boundary there. Hallways often have open sides. Walkways have open sides. Floors extend out onto decks. So we move easily between inside and outside without always making a big distinction, right? So this approach is the reason when you come here in the morning, the zendo is dark, because it's dark outside, right? What's happening in here is what's happening out there. So in the morning before dawn, in the evening after sunset, when you come into this room, it is not a blaze of light. If we're going to sit zazen, it's not a blaze of light because what's happening is it's dark outside. So there's, you know, not a huge boundary there. We're not cut off, we're not separated. So the second reason for this infinite changeability of size is that often the internal walls are removable or changeable. You can move them around. So as we've seen, space follows function, function follows space. So if what you need in this moment is a larger room or a smaller room, you can make that happen for whatever the given purpose is. So in my experience, if we had a tour bus of people that were coming for a sit-down lunch, that might be 50 people. We took walls out and we made the room very long. Or if we were doing a ceremony that required some small private space for a practitioner and the teacher or the abbot, we made a small private space for that purpose, right? So walls were on track. So whatever we did, the proportions were appropriate overall, right? There were tracks. We knew how big. We knew the proportion within the building. It always stayed appropriate. So if we also look for general nyoho characteristics in this building, we can see how all these themes are interconnected. So these buildings are made from what the builders actually have, trees and rice straw, and maybe some stone, right? The really, really traditional buildings, and maybe you know something about this, don't use nails. So the pieces are cut, intricately fitted together, and it's for several reasons. One is metal was harder to come by. There was metal, but it was harder to come by. And interestingly, there was a thing about not doing violence to the wood. So you're pounding a metal nail, and of course these usually were big, you're pounding a metal nail into wood. There's something about doing violence to that wood, which they wanted to avoid. So also, in addition to just this wood sort of keeping its integrity, because you didn't have nails, where, when you think about where Japan is in the world and what happens there, these buildings have to be earthquake proof. So in an earthquake prone environment like Japan, these joints flex. They move when the building is shaking, and there's less damage. So we can really see how this very practical nyoho stuff works, right? So using what we actually have takes into account the reality of this place and this time. So Buddhism came to Japan, as we know, from China and Korea. Those cultures influenced early building styles, but Japan has a different climate. Japan is not Korea, and Japan is not China. The climate is much different. In addition to the earthquakes, it's rainier, it's wetter, it's more humid, right? I remember in Kumamoto in June, gosh, it's like living under a waterfall for 30 days. The rain pours out of the sky for like literally 30 days. I thought, this is like living under a waterfall. And then July 1 comes and someone flips a switch and it's sunny and hot. Right? So there's a very particular climate these buildings were working with. So the roof tiles were designed to channel all that water to prevent erosion, right? So another nyoho element, reusing what we can. Some of these temples are 600 or 800 years old. They just keep being repaired, restored, preserved. These are not Shinto buildings. Shinto buildings take another whole approach. They rebuild Shinto buildings every 20 years. This is not what we're doing. So we can investigate that. That's another conversation. So this is also related to honoring and maintaining our connection to the past. I don't know about you, but when I'm practicing in a building where practice has been happening for 600 or 800 years, you feel that. There's something really interesting about that, right? So carpenters who are working on repairing, restoring these really old temples say that they feel like they are collaborating with the original builders, right? Those original builders are still in there somehow, right? So these folks that are coming in and maintaining these buildings are not cut off from these folks that built them originally hundreds and hundreds of years ago. They said there's just only so much you can learn from written instructions or from drawings or from verbal explanations from people. You really have to get in there and learn directly from the structures themselves and see how people built them. And I don't know if you, like me, are interested in like archaeology, but I love it when somebody unearths something or finds something in a cave and says, look, you can still see the tool marks. Look at somebody's fingerprint that's still on this pot that's 1,000 years old, right? Those builders are still there, man. So the people who are repairing feel like this is not, they're just coming in to do whatever. They're coming in as part of a team and collaborating with the people that originally built the building. So the materials they used, the techniques that they used, yes, the people who are repairing need to do something that's appropriate for today, using what we know today, the technology of today. But, learning also from what was done originally. So a nyoho shelter is practical, and it's also aesthetically pleasing. So the eaves on a soto or other temple buildings are oversized, and they tend to be fairly low, which makes it dim inside, right? Good for zazen, good for a settled practice. Also provides some shelter for the rain. We're in a really rainy environment, right? Sometimes walking outside, you can completely walk outside, but the eaves will shelter you from rain. The aisles, I'm thinking particularly now in the sections outside the actual soto, are wide enough to feel spacious, but they also feel fairly intimate, because they have to be wide enough that people can stand and do full bows. You have to be able to do full bows, either standing or to the floor. So they have to be at least that wide, right? So again, it's very much about who is individually in there using that space. Space is following function, and function is following space. So it's not random. No one's just taking a tape measure and going, I guess it'll be that wide. It's thinking about how do human bodies practice in that space, and what do we need? So in North America, we're almost always adapting buildings to make them places of practice. We don't have 600 and 800-year-old temples. We are adapting what we have, which is good and fine, right? It's hardly ever possible to actually reproduce a 600 or 800-year-old Japanese temple here. So it's not necessary, right? If we wait for the perfect conditions in order to practice, we're never going to practice. So we need to use what we have. Our Dharma centers don't need to look like 800-year-old Japanese temples. They do need to be unassuming, free from attachment. They need to use and reuse whatever we have or whatever readily comes to hand. It's good if they somehow acknowledge that Buddhism has a 2,500-year-old history, or that, Dogen lived 800 years ago. If at least we can nod to that, that feels helpful. In our case, we're acknowledging our 20th century ancestors by making sure we know exactly what it is we're being asked to do in this space. What exactly is the practice that we're being asked to do? So, Buddha sat on a grass mat under a tree, right? Dogen said in Fukanza Sengi, just find a quiet room, spread out a thick mat, put a cushion on it, right? Quiet, unassuming. In the Zui Monki, he tells a story about a monk who says, if monks could attain enlightenment by building a hall, we should construct one of gold and jewels. Enlightenment does not depend on whether the building is good or bad. It depends only on our diligence in Zazen. So, where we are, if we're waiting for some perfect Asian-inspired, pristine place, when are we going to practice, right? So, a building, this kind of building is a practical shelter. It keeps us safe, it keeps us healthy while we practice, but it can't do the practice for us. So I think one of the things we need to bear in mind this year as we're thinking about nyoho objects in particular is that those objects will support our practice. They are manifestations of our practice. They are not our practice. We can have an entire room full of nyoho teacups. That does not make us, that does not do the practice for us, right? It's great to have the cushion, but what gets us on the cushion is the bodhicitta. So it's fine to have a good building, but having the good building doesn't do the practice for us. It's fine to create and have things that are unassuming and have the right color of robes and all that stuff. We still need to do the practice. So these things are gateways into those teachings. They're manifestations of the teachings, but we have to be careful not to just cling to these things. If I just collect the right nyoho things, somehow everything will be okay. Interestingly, last night I watched a documentary about hygge. Maybe you know this word hygge, which is Danish. It's taken off in popular whatever, right? So many people know this word. And as I watched this, I thought, I think this is a Scandinavian version of nyoho. So when you ask somebody to define this word, they often can't. And in the West, we use things like cozy or comfortable, and they go, nah, that's not it. Because it has all these dimensions of sustainability and interconnectedness and human relationships and all these things. And I just look at that and go, that's really interesting. But one of the points that somebody made in this documentary, and it was someone who runs a business selling hygge-related things, was these are things, you can buy all the things. We're not here to tell you when you buy all the things, then your life will magically somehow have this approach. You need to have the approach, and these things will support that approach. So if you're interested, you can look at this hygge and nyoho and compare them, right? I think there's some connections, right? Anyway, I want to be sure when we're talking about food, clothing, and shelter, we're not grabbing onto those things and saying that's my practice. Those are things, right? So the building is a practical shelter. It keeps us safe, but we still have to go into the building and do the practice. Or enter the space if it's at home or wherever we are, right? And do the practice. No, the things can't do the practice. So on the one hand, we don't rely on those things or on any particular circumstance in order to say, now I'm going to practice because everything's perfect. But like clothing and food, the shelter is also not separate from our practice. So again, we're back to this idea, I think, about it shapes us while we give it shape. The building shapes us while we give the building shape, and I think that's true for food and clothing as well. So these are the three gateways we're going to explore in 25. I don't know of another Sangha that's digging into this in this particular focused, intentional way. It doesn't make us better. I do think we're doing something a bit new, despite how old these teachings are. So we're sort of breaking new ground here as a community. We're not only doing it for ourselves, I think we're doing it so that we can share what we learned this year and make that available to other Sanghas to engage in conversations with other practitioners, other Sanghas, folks at home, right? I hope it's a big ongoing conversation because look at all the ways in and all the things that can come out, right? Again, I didn't put a clock in front of me. I don't know what time it is, but I'm going to stop there and see what others would like to say about clothing, food, shelter. We're doing it in this particular order because I want to put food during the growing season, right? So we're going to take these things sort of in order and see what we can learn. I'm going to start with folks here, and then I'm going to go to folks virtually. What would folks here say, particularly maybe you, Hoshin, if you want to add on about, or Sawyer, maybe want to add on about food. But whatever's bubbling for anybody, please.
Yes, we're all looking at you.
Well, I'm putting him on the spot, just in case he wants to sort of
I do have something to say.
add on
It's
to
not-
some things that I said.
Yeah, it's not necessarily about shelter. This feels like, as we talk about this, it feels like it's entry into a thing that becomes complete. And we're looking at these 9 panels in a way that gives us, the proper kind of vision. And it's just what I'm looking at. I mean, it's just a comment around this.
Yeah.
I'm going to have plenty to say about shelter later because I've got some resources I've been digging up. So
Good. Good. Well, for the benefit of others, I actually asked Hoshin at some point. I said, before the end of 25, can you gather up what you think we should be looking at? So he started to do that work. Yeah, I just think so I agree with you, and as I'm trying to think about how am I going to explain this to the Sangha and start to engage in this conversation, there's so many points where, does this go under this or under this? Well, both. And I think that's, as I say, I think that's really good news, because those intersections, I think, are where the interesting conversations are going to happen, right? Because we're going to put things together that haven't been, put together in front of us. And, look at how those things fit, right? I just think there's just so much we can noodle on. I saw a couple other hands. I don't want to ignore other people.
You mentioned the Japanese architecture using no nails. Of course, we have one of those here in North America, in San Francisco. I spent a few days there up in Greengrass. This is in Center. They have kind of a tower architecture. It's very aesthetically appealing. It just blends in with the environment very nicely.
Well, when you're in those spaces, it's interesting. Either you notice it or you don't, right? You might never notice because it's so unassuming.
I didn't. I was told.
Yeah.
It's because everything just fit together so perfectly, and it was just so aesthetically beautiful.
But imagine the care they had to go into that, to measuring and cutting and fitting, right? I mean, there's something really, that's an offering.
I think they actually brought some people in from Japan.
Oh, I'm sure.
I'm sure we have that kind of skill here.
Well, because there's so imagine over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, how that's been handed down from generation to generation, right? We just don't have that yet. So to be able to rely on those resources is very helpful. So yeah, we have to look backwards. We have to honor and maintain our connections so that we can have that experience, but that doesn't mean we don't develop something here that works here, right? Yeah, those are interesting spaces, right? I saw, I think, some other hands, please.
I've been sitting with some things for a couple of years lately, and it's just developed naturally. Before I moved here, I'm a clothes whore. I enjoy buying shirts out the wazoo. My entire closet is maybe 3 button-downs, 50,000 t-shirts. And I only wear 8 now. And one of the things I have found naturally one of the things I have found is that as I have practiced, sure, I still want all these cool shirts. There's a website, 2046 Design. Oh, I'd love to have all of them. But it's I don't need them. And so I moved out of my closet and moved all my stuff into the laundry room, to where that's all I need. what you are telling us within nyoho is, for me, it seems nice as a practitioner. And I can relate to it as a practitioner. But as a civilian, I can't. And I'm kind of wondering, I mean, I have a pathway to call the herd, so to speak. But I have yet to have found the bodhicitta or the courage. What could you say to the civilians with nyoho and how to incorporate that and how they process life within a nyoho framework?
Well, that's a question that's going to take us a year to answer, so thank you for raising it. So I think this is why this is why it's helpful to have these little points that we can call out and say, unassuming, reuse what we have, just to give us some sort of touch points when we start to look broadly at how are we living. So if we're thinking we're going to do some divestiture, or we're going to do some, minimalism, and this is why I'm just emphasizing, I am not saying please, and I know you're not taking it this way, I'm not saying please go out and, empty your closet. That's not what's going on. But little by little, right? So I, as much as anybody, have pieces that I'm sentimentally attached to. Things my mother made that I can't wear, they don't fit me, but I can't get rid of them because my mother made it, right? Okay, that's fine. I think we can start with what are we acquiring even before we look at what do we own. Something that makes it a little easier for me to let go of something is if I can give it to somebody that I think can use it. Like Sawyer's got my sweatshirt that I bought the first time I was at AKG. I'm too broad in the beam these days, it fits him. So, there's something he would appreciate where that came from, okay. We can if we look at the teachings about dana, putting things giving things away to people that we don't know, letting go, opening the hand, that's not going to happen overnight, right? It's not going to happen overnight for anybody. That's a lifelong process. I would say I've been engaged in divestiture for decades. Just, do I need this? Can I get rid of it? Can I give it away to somebody? I think that's the practice. I think the reason that you're raising the question the way you're raising it is that it's not easy. In some ways, it's a big shift from our thinking, where we say, if I don't have material things, somehow I'm not secure. I don't know who I am. I'm not worthy. Right? And these are, we intellectually might know that's not the case, but something way down here is going, oh my gosh, if you don't have 100 shirts, you're not a real human being. So this is why these kind of teachings really point to some really basic stuff, right? There's some really wonderful things to noodle on. Nature of what is self? What is self-clinging? If we can't get rid of things, like what are we actually clinging to? We're probably not clinging to that thing. We're clinging to our idea about the thing, where it came from, what does it mean for me? I mean, this is all basic suffering, right? So these are ways to really, in a very concrete way, explore that stuff. So I think if we as practitioners can take on board these teachings, begin to look at how we live, not do something radical, just do something appropriate. What does that mean for people we know that are not practitioners? Well, they might look at what we're doing and saying, gee, you're doing something, what's going on with you? They might not. I don't think this is a case where we need to get up on a soapbox and evangelize. Often those are not teachable moments. This is not the time to go to your best friend and your mother and say, you need to get rid of all your stuff, because, especially right after the holidays, nobody wants to hear that. So we can start with what we're doing. If that radiates out a little bit, okay. If we're thinking about the larger economic systems, production systems, okay. But again, we got to start with what can this body and mind do? So can we pay attention? We don't have to forcibly, this is not about forcibly sort of convincing ourselves that something is true. This is about looking very carefully and saying, what actually is true here? What's my actual experience of this moment, this activity, this thing, whatever? Not, Hoko says I have to think this way. That's not it, right? It's about what am I directly experiencing, and then what do I think the effects of that are? And then the more we sort of open that up, we may naturally make some shifts. But this is not about forcing something. It's not about clinging and rigid and rules and that's not it. This is an opportunity to explore something which is bigger than the thing. that's a bigger answer to your question maybe than what you wanted. But again, my hope is we're opening up conversations, because I think this is not something that only happens at the Sunday Dharma talk. I think this is what happens around the tea table, right, and in the hallway, and just in our conversations about stuff. So we have some opportunities. Two-hand, I think I saw you before. I'll start with you and then go to you.
So I spent an entire semester studying abroad, and when you're doing that, you can't really bring much with you. And so I've spent the last few months just with whatever I was able to bring all the way to Japan. And, since then I did acquire a few new things, but not much. But when I came back, I kind of noticed a very interesting reaction to being bothered by how much stuff I had compared to in my home in Japan, where it felt like I had just the right amount of everything. And the first couple days I was able to get rid of a lot of stuff that I didn't feel like I needed. But then after that, I started finding that every little thing I had an excuse for, or I'm like, why do I own this? And I'm like, oh, right. Why would I want to get rid of this? And then I've noticed that despite the bigger picture, I want to get rid of all these things because I want to have something similar to the amount that I had in Japan. It seems that there's an excuse for every single thing that just increases over time.
Yep, so that's a conversation you get to keep having with yourself, right? And you don't need to negate those excuses. There might be really good reasons. Your mother gave you that, or your friend gave you that, or you got it, on a trip, or, it's not that you have to throw that out, but to have the conversation with yourself about each thing is interesting. I'm just about to move, and this is my opportunity. I love an opportunity for divestiture. I'm going through every single thing in every box and going, do I need this? Do I want this? So those are good opportunities, right? Please.
So this is kind of tangentially related to food, and the growing of food. So I have a friend back in South Carolina who goes to this place called Cowboy Church, where they mix in their worship. Instead of normal sermons, the sermons are happening while they're working on the farm, and they're mixing in their worship with farming. And I'm kind of curious, are there Buddhist equivalents to that?
Well, I would say, so our work practice clearly is more, as we know, our work practice is not volunteer work, our work practice is practice. So can we take that approach to, for instance, working with Sawyer to grow the food that we eat for Sashuna, for other things, right? Certainly that's a huge opportunity. So again, I think this is another case where if we look at the 9-patch, we go, how are these things actually separate? If we look at the practice vision, how are these things actually separate? So I think, work practice, certainly, if you look at where nyoho falls in the practice vision, here's work, and nyoho is kind of under that, because all the activity that we're doing to create or work with food, clothing, and shelter, it's work practice, but it's practice. We get to apply our sort of nyoho approach to that. So I think what you're opening up is one of the big intersections we get to talk about this year. It's not just, am I holding this row of potatoes? It's what is going on? Because it's not just even that immediate work. It's what's our overall approach? Why is it that we're growing these potatoes instead of going to buy some exotic root vegetable? I mean, there's just, right? It's just huge. So we've identified already several really interesting conversations that I think we have going forward.
I just want to say that reminds me of Green Gulch a bit, and I've never been there, but I've known some people who have, and I am curious if anyone sort of has experience there, knows a lot.
Probably these guys do, and during tea time, I encourage you. But this is the kind of thing, I encourage you all to get together and share that kind of stuff, because people have been in those circumstances. Sawyer's worked for small farmers locally. Yeah, these are the conversations I want to start having, because this is the stuff that's gonna come up. Right? We don't know, I certainly don't know it all today. We're not even into 25. I'm just sort of setting the stage for 25. I am just, based on this, I'm super excited about where this is going to go. Because I just think we've all got experiences, and we're all bringing something to that conversation. Gosh, I think it's going to be great. Good. Other things in this room?
You know that story about the renunciate who's meditating under a tree, but he's having a problem with mice? You know the story? And so he gets a cat to take care of the mice. But then he has to feed the cat. So he gets a cow to get milk for mouse. But then he has to do something about the cow. And then it keeps expanding and expanding and expanding. though all of a sudden he doesn't have time to meditate anymore because of all the distractions, taking care of all this property he has. And I think that's sort of the reasoning behind simplifying your life, because a life that's cluttered is one that makes it more difficult to practice.
Sure, of course. So I think the message there is ignore the mice. I saw another hand. Was it Sawyer and then Corey?
Yeah, so a couple of things in my mind related to the food part of this that I've been involved in, because it's interesting, because it feels like these are conversations that I've had with you and with Esho and, kind of behind the scenes, and now it's coming into the air.
Yep.
Which feels really good, because these are really helpful gates. And so when I'm thinking about what did you call it, the cowboy church? Or the
Yes.
cowboy-
That's what it's called.
So what I can sort of, I can say Owen knows this. Owen and I have been very involved in our little garden plot, and we certainly don't sort of have dharma talks while we're weeding or whatever.
Not overtly.
And yet, conversations come up. Like I remember weeding with Rachel, who's traveling in India right now. She's been involved in the garden. We were having a sort of infestation of harlequin bugs eating all of our kale and cabbage, and so very naturally a conversation about not killing, the precept of not killing emerged. What do we do about these bugs? What is weeding? What is it to eat, to just harvest a vegetable and eat it? And so engaging with those things, it's like, basically the work in the garden is itself a sutra in a certain kind of a way. You're engaging directly with teachings in a tangible way. And I know, of course, also Antaiji these days is like basically a working farm and temple at once. And their days basically consist of zazen in the morning and evening, and then working the fields or harvesting wood. And so these very kind of down to earth, touchable working as a community is very much in our lineage. And of course, Green Gulch is a place that I'd like to visit too. But one question that I want to sort of bring into the air with all this is, I've been thinking about the ways to put nyoho and precepts together is an interesting thing, because they're kind of like guidelines for how we're interacting with things and each other, and the Dharma. And one of the things we hear about precepts is they're kind of like teachings about good and bad, but we go beyond good and bad also. And I can see sort of the same theme emerging in this nyoho framework, which is very specific. I've worked with these 5 colors and 6 tastes in menu planning, and it is like it's like there's this box that you're
I've made charts for that too.
and you're fitting into it.
Yep.
And one of the things that it does, it takes your own opinions about what you want to make out of it, and you just fit. But of course, we also have in this tradition, I'm thinking of Vimalakirti's sort of admonition to one of Buddha's monks who only wanted to beg in the beg for food in the poor area. And because that food, was the most, like, he was just getting some grains of rice or some very simple, unassuming, sort of stuff that doesn't create attachment. And Vimalakirti says you should see the plainest, rice porridge or whatever, and the most decadent soup with equanimity.
As Dogen also says,
And
that
Dogen says the same thing.
Right.
And so I wonder how you hold those teachings about sort of everything I encounter is my life, and yet we're going to try to make certain decisions and distinctions about how we.
Yeah, well, so how are we acquiring that cream soup, right? How are we acquiring that fancy food? If we're acquiring that in some unwholesome way, that's not so good. But, if that's what somebody wants to offer, there's also something that says we have to let people offer, because offering is also a practice. So I think it was also Vimalakirti who was saying, there was somebody else who said, well, we should only beg in the rich areas because poor people don't have anything to offer. Maybe it wasn't Vimalakirti, but it's somewhere. And what came back was, no, you have to give everybody the chance to offer. Even if what they're offering is 2 grains of rice, people have to offer. It's part of the practice. So if that's what people are offering. So this is the same as we get into food. One of the things we've talked about with Tenzo training here is sometimes you have a wonderful, very sincere donor who will give you something for a meal which falls outside those guidelines. Like they want to give you some fried food. And you don't say, no, we're not taking it. You say, yes, thank you very much, and then you serve it in a way which does not interfere with the rest of the bowls, right? You don't get that grease on the other bowl. You take it, you serve it, but you treat it in a certain way, right? Because you can't just say no. That person is offering you something. So, these are not easy things, right? This is kind of complicated. We get to look carefully and balance good, bad, beyond good and bad. So, again, I think that's a conversation for the year. You've raised some interesting things, right, that we get to dig into, I think, all year long. Because I think it's not just food. In Dharma centers in particular, we have this thing that I've nicknamed the paramita of poverty, where we think somehow a Dharma center should never have anything nice, should never have enough money, should never have a good space, because if we do, somehow that's clinging and attachment and grasping. If we have donors that can provide for us and do that in a wholesome way, we don't have to immediately say, no, that's not okay. Because that's, we're immediately making a judgment and what's my idea about that, and, right? We can't be greedy and graspy and do things in an unwholesome way, but we also don't have to live in some way which is so poverty-stricken that we can't practice, if there's another way to do that. Things in this room. Oh,
yes.
You.
So I was I want to kind of add a layer to this and see if it's generative for people. So I was thinking a lot of these categories here, you could think of this as having a dimension in, as we interact with the internet and stuff, having a digital component as well. So I was thinking about how, as part of security practice and stuff like that, or being in the habit of looking at what apps do I have on my phone, what do they serve, my email accounts, what purposes do all these serve, in my social media accounts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's every account that you have is a potential attack vector that malicious actors could use, and you could be how you present yourself online, whether you're on TikTok and so on and so forth, what do you use everything for, et cetera, et cetera.
I think you totally can. So that's a good example of how I hope we're going to start with really basic everyday stuff and then start to do this. How does this affect my attitude toward paying attention to everything I encounter as my life? My social media accounts are my life, as well as, the rice in my bowl. So again, these are Dharma gates into these teachings, which I think have much, much bigger dimensions. I think there's multiple layers you could put on these things, right? So we'll start with some very concrete things, and then I hope during the year we do have conversations like that, right? So I'm glad people are taking it that way. I also hope, since you have paper and pens in front of you, you're jotting down, these are the questions I would ask, these are the things that she didn't cover, these are the extra things I want, not extra, but these are the other places this could go, because I don't want to lose that stuff, man. Let's capture that. I don't care if it's on a Post-it stuck in there, let's grab that stuff. Folks at home, anything from any of you? Ado, Tees, Satsu, Abby, people whose cameras aren't on. What you can't see, folks at home, is that we have a lovely big monitor now. We've just installed it. This is the first Sunday with it, and I can actually see who you are. So there's a big monitor on the wall, and I can actually see your lovely faces. Myo again is getting a picture even as we speak. Hello, Emil, you've got your camera on. Do you have something to say? Just waving. Okay.
No, I mean, Hoko, I really appreciate the framework of this and the kind of a thought that's went into this to provide the framework of exploration of the practice in the different dimensions of how that the things of our life, like Sawyer was saying, arises in our lives. So I think the framework is very is the gift kind of the exploration of how this, again, how practice arises every single aspect of your life and beyond. So I'm looking forward to what arises through these conversations that you wouldn't necessarily think about, like you were saying, social media, work, relationships, all of the aspects, how we tend to our homes, how we are with our animals. Just I think this is going to lend itself for a really good exploration of the practice. So looking forward to it.
I hope so. I think it's got its fingers in every part of the practice vision. So you can ignore my charts and graphs and diagrams. If that's not the way your brain works, you won't insult me. But I do think it opens up some really interesting discussions, and that's where I hope we go in 25. So I'm really glad to see people say, what about this? And what about this? And that's where I hope that goes. Any last things online or in the room today? We all good for the moment? We all nyoho'd out for the moment? Oh,
Abby?
Abby, thank you.
Yes, I need a little guidance as to where to find the 9-patch handout on the website.
If you refresh the virtual practice page, it should be right above the button to join.
And I think let's leave it up there for a little while. Probably, ultimately, it's going to go in with the larger nyoho resources I'm building online. But for now, I think we'll just say let's leave that link for a little while and let people, even those who maybe weren't here today, grab that, and just so you have it. So even if you go home today and you're here and you want to grab it, you can do that. But at least for now, people can keep papers here if they want and they don't get lost. So thank you, Abby, for that. Anything else today? Questions, logistics, teachings, ideas, things that are on fire for you that we don't want to lose? We okay for now? All right, so the very next thing we're going to do is have tea, and we can talk about food with tea. And watch some conversations. How about that? All right, good.
Well, we got some chanting to do first.
Pardon me?
We've got some chanting.
We do have chanting to do first, and then again, I'm sure during announcements we will hear from Sawyer about the nyoho workshop that's happening at the end of January. So let's kind of connect the dots. Chant first, and then announcements. Yes? All right. Thank you, everybody.